like it's 3 o'clock Eastern time, so let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining today's Scaling Up webinar presentation that the Fish and Wildlife Service will be presenting to us today. My name is Brian Fainer and I'm with the Scaling Up team with the Park Service. And as a reminder, Scaling Up is a Park Service's large landscape conservation initiative, an effort. Ray Savageau is our NLC champion, and this is one of many webinars that is a part of our webinar series on tools and information that we can all use to further our landscape conservation efforts. Today's presenter is Melanie Steinkamp. Melanie, am I saying your last name correctly?
Yep.
Okay, with Fish and Wildlife Service, and she is the Special Assistant to the Fish and Wildlife Service's Assistant Director for Science Applications. And importantly, they're in charge of the landscape conservation efforts there, and she's been with the Fish and Wildlife Service for about 11 years. Has also worked for Wetlands International, USGS, and has a great deal of experience. So with that, I'm going to pass the controls over to Melanie to begin her presentation. Hold on one second here, Melanie. I'm making you the presenter. Oh, and for everyone on the phone, if you can put your phone on mute, that would be extremely helpful. If you're not, we'll have a questions, time for a Q&A later on, but until then, please put your phone on mute. Thank you.
All right, let me know if you are seeing my screen.
Looks good.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for giving us an opportunity to present on the work that we have underway at the Fish and Wildlife Service with respect to conservation at the landscape scale. You know, our mission at the Fish and Wildlife Service is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. We, at the Fish and Wildlife Service, we work through programs. We have a National Wildlife Refuge System. We have a migratory bird program. Our Ecological Services program works with threatened and endangered species conservation needs. We have our Fisheries and Aquatic Conservation program. And then the newest program is our Science Applications program, of which I'm a part. And we are really focused on landscape conservation efforts, climate change, and then we also have scientific integrity and information quality. I have this connecting people with nature in a little box simply because it's a priority of our agency. We recognize the need to impassion the public with conservation, and especially given change in demographics and increased diversity, it's something that we need to do through all of our programs. So why landscape conservation? What's different now? You know, why the need? Many say that we are now, they define the geological time period that we're in now as the Anthropocene. Because humans are influencing every part of the system, from the oceans to the atmosphere to the terrestrial systems. There are now about 7 billion people in the world, and by 2050 there will be 9.6 billion, and that is the equivalent of doubling the current population of China and India within 35 years. So you know, there are great changes going on. So what does this mean? It means there's going to be far more demand for food, for water, for energy, and with a huge shift of people moving into urban areas, people will have less contact with nature. So all of this is going to put huge demands, and is putting huge demands on the natural systems of the world and has huge implications for conservation policy and support in what we do with our conservation dollars. So this is like in 3 slides is why is it important for us to begin to really focus our work at the scale of the landscape and to work in partnership with one another. We can take a quick look at just how fast the system is changing. You can see in the top, for some reason the bottom one isn't flashing, the urban density, but there have been huge changes in with population growth, urban density, and you can see that in the southeast, the systems have shifted pretty dramatically from 1990 to 2012, and so these systems on which fish and wildlife depend upon are having to change, and the systems are having to change with them, or the species. And also society's values are changing because our demographics, the way the view of our demographics is changing. Our demographics are changing. We're just far more diverse population. And things are continuing to change. So we have new cultures, different values, all kinds of things that we have to consider. We also need to be a lot more accountable. The nation's Fish and Wildlife Services are publicly owned, and they trust us, the government, to take care of them and to benefit them. And they want to know where their resource dollars are going, their dollars are going. They really want to know, what are they getting, what return on investment are they getting within our public lands and conservation. So we need to be in a position where we can describe how much we're spending, why we're spending it, where we're spending on it, how much we need. And this all requires a large-scale look, looking through a view, a lens that is looking broad scale and in partnership with one another. Why else? We also have, there's been a lot of change. We've learned a lot. Even 10 years ago, we didn't have the ability to crank through the amount of data on a computer system. So, conservation theory has changed and is continuing to evolve as we learn more. Through the digital revolution, we are able to do a lot more than we could 10 to 20 years ago. Just looking at what we can do through geographic information systems to help us understand what the system looks like now versus what it might look like in the future through modeling. And decision theory continues to evolve, and so we're continuing to learn how to make better decisions. And these are just some of the products that are out there that show how much evolution and ingenuity we have. So again, we need to change the way we're addressing and implementing conservation because of these rapid and system level changes. We have to do it because we need to be more transparent and accountable to the folks who are providing the resources for us to conserve our natural resources. We need to be accountable for what we're doing, and because we have all these advances that are occurring and will continue to occur. We don't know what it will look like 10 years from now. So this is just showing habitat loss and housing density over the years. This is another why. It's like, when we kind of get away from the individual parcels of land that we are responsible for and look broader, we can see, this is showing you from 1940 through time, how housing density has changed in the Northeast. Oops. And so what this says is that, when we look at this, we think, okay, in 1940, if I knew that the landscape was going to look this way today, would I make similar decisions? We can only do this if this isn't, we're like planning for the future and making the best decisions is not going to happen without us really working together, strategically thinking about how we identify what the needs of the system are into the future. And we need to do this in partnership because I don't believe any of us own an entire landscape. There may be some situations where a landscape is mostly in conservation, especially in like a place like Alaska, but most of us are not dealing in that world. And then climate change is a huge threat that just is overarching everything we do and all of the decisions we make. We need to be able to make decisions that allow our systems to have some resilience to climate change. And this can't be tackled alone and at a small scale. The decisions we make and the actions we take need to be within the context of the larger problem. So then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of landscape conservation in the Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, we've been working at landscapes for decades. We may not have used the term landscape, but we haven't set up the mechanism that allows us to reach really broadly and pull in some of our non-traditional partners. So this is just showing that in 1986, out of the North American Waterfowl Management Program, there was a recognized need to work together through partnerships at large scales to put on the ground the habitat needs for waterfowl, and then in the 2000s for all migratory birds. And out of that were developed these migratory bird joint ventures and bird conservation regions. So these were the landscapes at which planning and decisions were made for migratory bird conservation. Then in 1996, the Fish and Wildlife Service charted out a new policy to take an ecosystem approach for fish and wildlife conservation, and this was an effort to bring together partners with divergent issues to come together and come up with common solutions or common goals at an ecosystem scale. So a lot of these things are not brand new, but we haven't maybe formalized or really mechanized the process that allows us and helps us to get it done. And this is just saying, you know, Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service are not strangers to working together, that's for sure. I mean, we've been doing it for decades, and in South Florida, that's just one of the examples, the Southern Everglades Restoration Alliance in the 1990s, where we worked together to come up with a plan for how to deliver the water through the system and meet the needs of all the stakeholders involved. You're all aware of the landscape conservation cooperatives, which came on board in 2009 through a secretarial order, which was put in place really to address climate change, begin addressing the impacts of climate change. So we now have a system of landscape conservation cooperatives in place, whose mission is to, or vision is to have landscapes capable of sustaining the resources that we really care about into the future. Fish and Wildlife Service partners to work with the landscape conservation cooperatives. We do a lot of the staffing to help support and facilitate the efforts, both across the networks and within individual LCCs. But the LCCs are not Fish and Wildlife Service entities. So this, again, is a mechanism that allows us to work at the scale of the landscape with the stakeholders in that landscape. So we have this network of landscape conservation cooperatives, and the National Academy of Sciences was asked to do a review of the first 5 years of the LCCs, 4 or 5 years, and found that the landscape approach was justified and needed. So these LCCs have been created as a structure that will enable Fish and Wildlife Service and Park Service to actually begin to scale up a lot of our efforts and work together. So this shows you, this is a map just showing of the 22 LCCs that are in existence. You can see that the Park Service is actively involved in at least 21 of them. Just to say that, you know, this is already happening, but we need to continue to communicate with one another and work within that landscape scale. So some of the tools that are available to help us work, I at the landscape scale and policies that have been put in place. In 2012, you all are aware of the climate adaptation strategy that the Department of Interior bureaus are using to help us implement actions for climate change. Within the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have a climate adaptation network, which was formed in 2014, and they meet periodically. And the purpose of this group, all of our programs are represented, and they develop the appropriate policies and priorities for climate change activities, and want to make certain that across the Fish and Wildlife Service, our programs are using risk-informed decision-making to help us implement the best strategies for climate change through our programs. So really this group is promoting the two goals, climate change adaptation and then mitigation for climate change. We also, in the Fish and Wildlife Service, use what we call strategic habitat conservation. This is similar to adaptive resource management. The only way it differs is that within the Fish and Wildlife Service, we are committed to using strategic habitat conservation at the landscape scale. So this strategic habitat conservation is really an it's a process that helps us strategically identify the conservation targets that are priorities for us within a landscape, and develop objectives, what we'd like to see them obtain, and then to go through the process of mapping out where within that landscape we need to target our efforts, and come up with a strategy for delivering conservation actions. So this is used across programs again. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of our different programs are doing to begin to work at the landscape scale. This is just one example, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. This was a large partnership that was formed to look at how to site renewable energy projects within the desert region of California, while also conserving and managing the plants and wildlife communities within that system. Again, it was partnership driven, and all of the stakeholders were part of the process. You had state agencies, federal agencies, local governments, industries, and NGOs, all involved to try to help make the best and most strategic decision about where to place renewable energy projects such that there was the least amount of impact to the natural system. So this is an example of how we're thinking broader. We're not doing it project by project or permit by permit within our ecological services. Ecological Services has also developed a new draft mitigation policy. It's not final yet, but when you take a look at the policy, the mitigation policy, and this is our mitigation policy for any of the activities that affect threatened and endangered species. This is not climate change mitigation, but the new policy is stating that a landscape scale approach is going to inform mitigation planning, and that climate change needs to be considered when we're thinking about the scale, nature, and location of the mitigation that we're going to accept, and that the service will foster partners to help design these mitigation strategies. So again, this is kind of taking in working within the landscape scale through partnerships to best deliver and be successful at our conservation efforts. And then finally, in Ecological Services, we've had the Greater Sage Grouse Partnership. And again, this was, Fish and Wildlife Service was a key player in this effort, which was a coalescing of many partners who came together. So it was, again, state agencies, federal agencies, ranchers, conservation groups, and others, to implement as many sage grouse conservation projects and secure as much protection for sage grouse habitat as was possible. And we wanted to do this prior to the September 2015 ESA listing decision deadline, because we wanted to use this information when we were making our listing decision. So we worked with BLM, ranchers, and many other partners to put some of this habitat protection and restoration on the ground. And what resulted in it is because of all of the work that the partners did together by identifying the most important habitats and areas to focus our efforts on, the threats to about 90% of the breeding habitat for the sage grouse was reduced much, and so we were able to withdraw it from the candidate list. So that's another example of how, working at this landscape scale and through partnerships, we were pretty successful for sage grouse. Then our refuge system is also beginning to put in place the mechanisms for landscape conservation planning efforts and implementation efforts. In 2011, the refuge system produced a visioning document, and this Conserving the Future document recommends that any plans that refuges do be done within a landscape context. So not looking beyond the individual refuge, but how does that refuge fit into the landscape within which it sits, and to describe actions to project conservation benefits beyond that refuge's boundaries. So it's saying that it's setting up a framework for refuges to think and plan and work within the landscape. And so again, this isn't planning the same old way, because you know, traditionally refuges would plan just within their borders, but we're moving beyond that, and we're setting up policies and mechanisms to help us do that. So now all of the comprehensive conservation plans that are done by refuges are done within this landscape context and through partners. Refuges also has an inventory and monitoring program. I have this in here because this is really a key part of the adaptive management or strategic habitat conservation cycle. We have to be able to monitor so that we can assess how we're doing with our conservation actions, whether they are actually moving us towards our the goals that we've set for our conservation priorities, our targets. And this is one of the places where I think that maybe there's more opportunity than we are maybe taking advantage of for Fish and Wildlife Service and Park Service to cooperate on. I think there may be ways for us to help one another within the scale of the landscape when it comes to inventory and monitoring. And then we also have the Human Dimensions branch, which is a fairly new branch, but recognizing that humans are a part of the ecosystem and that all of our planning and implementation moving forward needs to account for the needs of people within that landscape. We have this branch which looks at the relationships between people and the wildlife and habitat that we protect. And I have it up here because we do have some tools available to practitioners who are working in conservation, and I'm aware that the Park Service also has a similar branch, but this may also be an opportunity there may be some opportunities here for us to collaborate as well. All right, then landscape conservation design. So this is part of the strategic habitat conservation cycle and also the adaptive management cycle. And for us, it consists of three main components. So first, you're going to assess the current conditions within the landscape. So you've set your priorities. You know what you want to conserve within that landscape. Now you're going to look at the conditions of that landscape. Then you're going to spatially represent the desired future conditions of the landscape. So you use models and spatial models to help you identify what the landscape needs to look like in the future in order to support your priorities, your species and habitat priorities. And then you develop a plan to show, to help your managers identify what conservation actions to take to move the landscape from what it looks like today to what it needs to look like in order to support the priorities, conservation priorities. And this is another way to show landscape conservation design, and the purpose of this is to show that landscape conservation design is not just a set of products, it's a process and products. It's very important that at the very beginning, you're convening all the stakeholders within that landscape. And among those stakeholders, you are identifying some shared goals, and you're identifying the conservation targets that you want to achieve within that landscape. Then the products are developing data and maps and using models to assess the conditions in the landscape and what you need that landscape to look like. And then out of those come the strategies. After the design is complete, each partner then tiers it down. So you could see this is done in partnership. So you would have, this is an example where you'd have all these different federal agencies involved in the process, so all the stakeholders. And then when you have this landscape conservation design, which is helping you to see where the priorities in the landscape are, each of those partners then tiers it down to their statutory planning process to figure out what piece of it they can help accomplish in that landscape and to deliver the conservation. Some of the potential outputs and outcomes that can come out of this process, you have tools, things like story maps, which help explain to the public and to some of our funders, why it's important that we have the resources and what we're going to do with them. You can have prioritization tools, geospatial data layers that help you determine what you need to do within that landscape. You can have a portfolio of priority conservation areas. You also could have conservation and human well-being targets and goals. You have strategies that help you target your conservation dollars. And importantly, for the accountability and transparency component, you have quantified what you expect to gain by expending their resources. And then also there's the collaborative implementation. So just working together, you can accomplish so much more and leverage so much more. So just opportunities for collaborating during the landscape conservation design process, just because you have questions that can be addressed, like what are the shared goals for conservation in this landscape? Which habitats or system features are going to help us maintain the benefits that we need under this changing ecosystem, considering climate change and urban growth and all of the other threats and stressors? Where do we need to target our efforts? And what opportunities are there for partners within the landscape to collaborate on many, many different things, including monitoring. And one example that my colleague Ben Thatcher came up with earlier was just invasive species. If you're thinking about how are we managing invasive species, it's really challenging to do within the boundary of a park or a wildlife refuge or without looking beyond and within the context of the landscape. So this is just a good example of how we can work together to have better success. It needs a holistic approach. Some of the lessons learned, so these are Melanie's lessons learned, I just have to couch that. Based on my experience with the joint ventures and many, many years ago, the ecosystem team approach, I think if we're going to succeed, we have to have buy-in by all of the partners and the stakeholders. All of the work actually gets done at the ground level in the field. So it can't be a top-down effort. That's not to say that there can't be a national effort in place to provide the mechanism and the structure and the tools to help us do our work in the landscape. But we need to have folks understand and be excited about working together to try to really achieve great conservation outcomes in the field. And to do that, this is kind of one of those no-brainers, but you got to have trusting relationships. So we have to have good communication, and we need to follow through on what we say we're going to do. And that there's just great opportunity in collaborative conservation. I think we can get far beyond where we are now if we really put our heads together and we work together. So this is Henry Ford said it, coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress, and working together is success. And so that's what I have. Take questions.
Thanks, Melanie. That was excellent. A lot of great information. Are there any questions from the group? And you can, of course, take yourself off mute so we can hear you if you have any questions. Or you can also, if you want to type in a question too, you can use the chat box and type in a question there as well. Well, I've got a question off the top of my head. Well, actually, I have a list of questions here, Melanie. But the story maps that you mentioned, what did those look like? How do they work?
I don't think there's one set way to do them, but when you have a plan, so if you come out with a landscape conservation design, and you have a plan and you know that you're trying to achieve, you want to raise the population of a particular, I'm a bird person, so let's say a particular bird within a landscape, and you know that you need, in order to do that, you have to have these pieces of habitat. You can actually use, it's like a visual sort of thing. You say, okay, we're starting, we have this many birds here, and it can be a graphic, right? Mm-hmm. But if we get this habitat, we can have this many birds, and you just bring once you have a good plan, you can use fairly simple graphics to help you tell the story about what it could look like given, certain resources.
And do you guys, when you're developing those, are you including other stakeholders, like the private property owners or whoever else surrounding the refuge, or is that kind of a internal product?
I think it depends. I mean, it certainly depends on the landscape, and maybe Ben can pitch in here too because he's working more directly with the LCCs. But I can say, in my experience in working with partners, it completely depends on the partners that are involved. But often, if you've gone through this process and people have been heard and their priorities have been, have been shuttled through the process, then folks are usually on board with what comes out the bottom end. And so it's not an issue to tell the story about everybody, including the stakeholders. It always gets tricky with private landowners. So.
Right, I bet. All right, other questions? I've got another question for you, Melanie. Critical habitat for T&E species. How does that, when Fish and Wildlife Service, has designates critical habitat for threatened or endangered species, how does that fit into landscape conservation planning? I mean, where is that captured? I mean, maybe that's captured in a number of different places, but how does that fall in?
Okay, I'm to say I'm not a T&E species expert for critical habitat, but I know that in my experience, when you are starting the process within a landscape and you're identifying the priorities, threatened and endangered species are always priorities. We have no choice, really, and so as part of the desired future conditions for that landscape, usually the recovery plans will help define what some of those future conditions need to be. So that includes some of the critical habitat elements. So when you're looking at identifying habitats within the landscape that might support that threatened and endangered species into the future, you're using those critical habitat designations to help you define and identify those, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, it looks like we've got a question here from Sean Johnson. Great presentation, lots of great work and lessons. What challenges or barriers does the Fish and Wildlife Service face when doing landscape scale work from either policy or practical dimensions?
Oh, okay. Well, we've had lessons learned. I mean, I can tell you that the LCCs have come a long way, but there are challenges just from the standpoint of, some of the states are not as on board with landscape conservation cooperatives as others. A lot of that is, again, I said, we got to build trust, and some of that takes time, and LCCs aren't that old yet, so some of it is just taking the time to allow that trust to build. But you know, most of the challenges come down to communication and making certain that folks are heard and listened to and feel like they are a part of the process. So for us, you know, we often will put a policy in place at headquarters, and then we expect it to just be embraced by the field, and that usually isn't the way it works. So some of the lessons learned that we've learned is that we need to really think hard about how we're going to communicate a message, and when we're thinking about these kind of high-level, broad-scale efforts, we need to bring folks in from the field. We need to bring folks from the field in the beginning, because folks need to feel like they're part of the process of developing the policy. So anyway, that's kind of a roundabout way of saying, again, you don't want it to be too top-down. You can't direct something to happen when the actual work has to happen at the field.
Great. And then looks like a question here from John Putnam. Can you talk a bit about the special challenges of large landscape conservation across international boundaries with Canada and Mexico, for example?
Okay. Ben, do you want to jump in on this one? I can talk about joint ventures, but I don't have a lot of experience in the actual LCCs that are international.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, I'm Ben Thatcher. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's kind of getting them involved in the partnerships, and really just trying to, part of it is getting people to understand or appreciate that what we're trying to do at a broad scale is not necessarily it's going to provide context and information that can inform more scaled-down decision-making, but it's not going to affect any individual organization, be it international or other state entities, authorities, or jurisdictions. And so I think it's just kind of explaining, some of the challenges are just explaining that the scale that we're trying to tackle these challenges require a level of cooperation and planning that's informing individual planning efforts, but is not dictating or meddling with those efforts.
I think often, I mean, maybe not so much with Canada, but with Mexico, when you're working internationally across these landscapes, some of it is capacity. I mean, we always run into it, right? But some of the challenges are having the capacity to take the action needed, or to even participate in the process. So it's making it a priority such that you can come up with the resources needed to get the really important stakeholders there.
Money.
Yep, that's what I'm saying. It always comes down to that. But I think there are ways to deal with it. I mean, if it's recognized as a priority, and you're thinking, you know, it's not at the last minute you go, oh, so and so, you know, this important stakeholder can't come because they don't have the means. I think if you are planning for that up front, and so this is being strategic, it's a little easier to pull together what's necessary to get them there. So yeah, I always think it's like, be inclusive, you know, think really broadly in the very beginning.
Right. And Dan Kimball, great to hear. Great you joined us, Dan. Dan asked, how are Fish and Wildlife Services landscape conservation efforts funded? Yeah, how much is there? Are you guys able to, through your partnerships, maybe are you guys able to help fund your efforts?
This is Ben. I'll take a stab at this one. So in terms of the Fish and Wildlife Service funding in support of the LCCs, we make a request through the President's budget to get funding through what we call two funding categories. One is for adaptive science, and one is for collaborative landscape conservation. So it's through the Science Applications Program that we secure funding through congressional appropriations that we then use to help support the efforts of the LCCs in terms of staff capacity, as well as funding to do the planning and science projects that the individual LCCs do.
Okay, so pretty much all the LCC work, at least from the administrative side, is through your science applications program?
That's in terms of the direct contributions for staff. Now, I will say that the National Park Service provides staff. Many other federal agencies provide staff and project funding, as do state and other partners. And that's not counting the contributions of other partners in terms of time or other project match.
Great. All right. Any other questions for Melanie or Ben? All right. Well, thanks, guys. This is great. Thank you so much, Melanie and Ben and everyone else there at Fish and Wildlife Service for working with us and presenting, giving us insight as to how you guys are working on landscape conservation. And of course, I know at the park level, the field, and in our Washington offices, I know we're working and partnering with you in various ways, shapes, and forms. But again, we just appreciate you guys giving a glimpse into your inner workings, and so we can better all work together on this landscape conservation work.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having us.
All right, keep in touch.
Okay.
And thanks everyone for joining. And we have a recording of the webinar, and we're gonna this will also be posted on our Scaling Up Toolkit website, and then also our site on the Practitioners Network for Landscape Conservation. That's if you're not with the Park Service, that's the place to go to get the recording. So thanks again, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.